Brian, thank you so much for the very generous introduction. As Brian mentioned, I was in this room as a postdoc 10 years ago. And I remember it was when Hye-Jin Yoon was visiting for the first time. She was giving a talk. And so a lot of these memories, same sandwiches that I also had when I was at the time. Um, and 10 years ago when I was here, data science and big data, these were still buzzwords that I don't think many people use as much these days. But I'd like to kind of go back and reimagine those terms. What do we mean by data science? Maybe not so much big data, but yes, big data as well. And there are a couple of motivations for doing so, especially in this day and age of AI. Okay, so the first motivation is, let's just kind of step back and think about the explosion of data since, the early stages of recorded history. Right, 3000 BC, all the way up to now. And we've seen this explosion in records, historical sources, and in more modern times, data. And it doesn't look like this trend will shift or change anytime soon. And yet, when you look at academic fields, I think it's safe to say that across the board, there is this sort of bias for fresh data, and understandably so. We are just flooded with new data every year, every second even. And so we're sort of having a hard time digesting all that. We're always pursuing new data. And this isn't just the sentiments that people or scholars have. It actually is codified in journal publication policies, submission policies, and things like that. For example, Journal of Advanced Nursing, they specify that in their authorship guideline that the data collection should ideally be no more than 3 years before submission of the manuscript. Right? So there are these institutional sort of guidelines, and depending on the field, it might be more rigid or soft, but I think it sort of illustrates our scholarly or academic bias for fresh data. Now, again, the problem I think is that we don't really have time to digest what we already have. It's hard to keep up with the state of the art. Like, there is this sort of race to the top, or a race to be the first in terms of utilizing fresh data sources and turning them into publications. And there are these academic incentives to do so as well. Now, I think one potential issue with that is that the knowledge that we produce and the questions that we ask might be also biased as a result. The discoveries are going to be more geared towards recent phenomena and whatever biases that might be embedded in these data sets. Those will also bias the discoveries that we make and the theories that we construct, as well as more fundamentally the questions that we ask. Okay, so that's the first motivation. Secondly, we have this explosion of AI, and there is this idea of a scaling hypothesis that if you throw more compute, more data to train these generative AI models, performance will increase. Of course, there will be diminishing marginal returns, which I think create a problem. Because if you want to have the same sort of gains in the next step, you need that much more data. Now, one problem is because of this diminishing marginal returns, one approach to training these models is to use the generated or regenerated data from the models, use them to train subsequent models, right? And there has been a lot of research on this idea of model collapse, right? When you train your models on recursively generated data, the model collapses. There's sort of a regression to the mean and reduction in perplexity and all these negative consequences. And at the heart of it, I think the fundamental issue is that we humans are not generating data at the speed at which these models require. Yeah.
That's one way to see it, right? To say that we cannot generate enough data to train the models. Another way to look at it is that the models are inherently flawed and require impossible amounts of data to be trained and improve.
Yeah, sure. Maybe it is the model itself and perhaps there needs to be a fundamental shift in how we train the models. And but I think the bigger point that I'm trying to make still stands that. Yeah. I see. Yeah, and perhaps it's both. Those are different aspects. So I guess one solution that what you've pointed out implies is we need to develop new architectures, right? So it's the architectural sort of approach. What I'll be talking about today is about the data itself. But yeah, a great observation. So these models are always hungry for new data. So those are the two main sort of motivations of thinking about data and reimagining data science. Another important piece of this is that existing data sets, when you combine them in new ways, that can lead to scientific advances that are much more impactful and sort of, I don't know how to put it, cost efficient than simply merging and combining different ideas from the past. And this comes straight from Yulin's work here. And I found that there are similar sort of rationales behind the implications of this work and what I'll be talking about today. Primarily, I'll be using my own research as examples of reimagining data and thinking about our relationship with old data that have been already produced. Okay, so there will be 3 studies. I'll try to summarize as quickly as possible, but please note that the focus is on the uses of data. Okay, that's the part that I want to sort of emphasize and perhaps have a discussion later during Q&A. Okay, so my first study is about the question of political polarization online. When you look at these survey-based results, it is questionable whether there is actually increasing or intensifying political polarization. And we're talking about the US, right? So the evidences are mixed. Of course, in the sort of formal political arena, there is, yes, a lot of polarization among the politicians and the elites. But for the masses, it's unclear. But we do know for a fact that in social media and in online spaces, there is a very sharp and unmistakable sort of opinion polarization that goes online. Whether it's Twitter, Reddit, and there are studies of this happening, showing empirically how polarization intensifies. So the question is, why do we see this sort of opinion polarization that intensifies online? There are a lot of different explanations, and I'm just adding another explanation or a mechanism as to why this might be happening online. And the proposed mechanism, it has to do with the idea of context collapse. You have, in the physical world, we have walls, we have windows, we have these physical barriers that naturally create the context for social interaction. But if you think about Twitter X or these online social platforms, they were designed actually to kind of erase those contexts so that information can travel more fluidly, more transparency and openness, right? You can see early interviews by Mark Zuckerberg talking about these ideas. So it was sort of conceived on this idea of openness and transparency, which also means that the contexts that turn out to be essential for interactions and understanding and forming opinions, those tend to get erased. So what do I mean by that? You might have these different social groups in your lives, right? You might have a very conservative family, but progressive, college friends. You may have grown up in an evangelical church, that may have been your primary group. But in college, you join a fraternity, and the expectations, norms, and things like that are very different, right? And this doesn't necessarily cause any issue in the offline world because we can sort of separate out the context, right? My family, they don't need to know like what I did with my fraternity, brothers last Friday, for example. So there's this network diversity to varying degrees in our lives. But when those contexts are erased, we often tend to kind of check ourselves in terms of what we talk about, what we post on social media. So there is this sort of self-censorship that happens. And presumably, there is a stronger tendency to self-censor if you are a network broker, meaning if you have a more diverse communication network online. And so if the network brokers are self-censoring more, let me remind you that the network brokers, these are like opinion leaders. These are people who can wield more influence in terms of integrating different ideas, different groups of people. And yet, when they self-censor, maybe that is related to the extreme opinion polarization that we observe online. Okay, so that's the post mechanism that I'm developing here. Now, let me shift back to the idea of data and trying to use old data to test these new ideas or theories. The primary hurdle here is how do you measure self-censorship, right? By definition, self-censorship is a non-event. You sort of filter your thoughts and you don't speak up or post your ideas. So by definition, you can't observe them unless like you administer a survey or use other more sort of looking at biomarkers or things like that. So that's the problem. Like, how do you observe self-censorship? Now, what I focused on was the deleted tweets. Right? People post on Facebook or Twitter, wherever, and then they later regret and delete their tweets. Right? So this is sort of the way I think about it. So when this person has an idea, the first thing they will think about is it appropriate or inappropriate to post this on Twitter? And through that sort of internal filter or classifier, the answer might be positive or negative. If it is negative, meaning that it is not inappropriate, then the person would tweet or post it, but later find out that it was not appropriate. Right? So in response, the person deletes the tweet. So that would be the false negatives in your internal inappropriateness classifier that you would be capturing in the deleted tweets. So I count the number of deleted tweets per user over a long period of time, and that's the sort of behavioral measure of self-censorship that I use. Now here's, yeah.
According to your argument, the way you're looking at this, couldn't the person be pressured to remove the tweet? So they're not actually self-censoring anything. They're just bowing to the pressure of what other people are saying.
Mhm.
So how is that self-censorship?
So if you kind of look at it from a longer sort of time frame, those are educational movements, right? You learn, there's social learning that this isn't appropriate. Oh, I didn't realize that it could offend or be inappropriate for some of my friends, especially if I'm a network broker, I would be more likely to experience those kinds of moments. And so then I would self-correct and learn not to post those kinds of tweets in the future. So if you sort of aggregate the deletions over a longer period of time, then I'm sort of making the argument that yes, people kind of learn to self-censor, and that's going to show up as increased number of deleted tweets.
So can you give me an example of this? Like something I'm thinking about, I just read in the paper about someone who was fired because they said something about Charlie Kirk, the individual who was assassinated. And basically what the stories said in the press, which I wasn't able to look at it myself and know it's exactly true, but basically they posted something that Charlie Kirk himself had said in quotes, and it was in fact a quote of his. And then they were forced to remove it because they were told, if you don't, you'll be fired. In your data, that would look like self-censorship. To me, that looks like they're being pressured by an external force to change what they really do believe. Now, maybe they self-censor themselves in the future because maybe they wanted to say more things about Charlie Kirk, but they don't do that now, and now they're self-censoring. So, like, how do you, disentangle all of that?
So when you self-censor, you're not necessarily changing your opinion, right? Whether you are receiving external pressure more informally from your friends or from your job, right? Your employer forces you to take it down. Either way, you sort of learn not to post something like that in the future.
Right, but you can't observe that because you don't.
You cannot observe that, yeah. So I think you're getting at a very critical sort of shortcoming of this study. When I frame this as self-censorship, but even if we don't think of this in terms of self-censorship, behaviorally speaking, you have these content retractions, right? And that affects the opinion distribution that people can observe. So even without assuming self-censorship, just behaviorally speaking, there will be these changes or shifts in opinion distribution that people can observe. And maybe that is what is really the issue or the cause for generating more polarization online. Okay, so
Can I just ask one more quick question, just because I find this very interesting? For me, self-censorship would be someone's has been going along posting things about Charlie Kirk, potentially critical of him. And then the assassination happens and they realize that they're going to be penalized in one way or another for continuing what they had done. What you observe there is that you don't see anything about Charlie Kirk after that. That to me looks like self-censorship. So you have some kind of event that is inserted into the system that is what causes someone to censor themselves.
And then once they start censoring, you wouldn't be able to observe them in the deleted tweets. Is that
So
what
they talk about A, then there's an event, and after A, they don't talk about, after the event, they don't talk about A anymore.
Mhm. Right. So yes, that can happen, but and keep going back to shifting the unit to the overall distribution, right? Yes, at the individual level, once they start really self-censoring in the sense that these become non-events, they don't express their opinions about Charlie Kirk or whatever. Yes, that is true self-censorship, but that's true self-censorship was sort of shaped by these maybe mistakes that they made along the way, and we're capturing those. As I said, these are like false negatives that we're picking up. So yes, there are definitely limitations to sort of conceptualizing these deletions as self-censorship. But I guess the broader point I'm trying to make is if you shift to the overall distribution of ideas, of opinions, and things like that, there are like real shifts to the opinion distribution that people can actually observe.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, clarification? Yeah. The data are there, so we can certainly look into it, like zoom in that way and look at it, right? Because I'll be talking about the data a little bit in a couple of slides later, but yes, that is in principle possible. Okay, so going back to the presentation, you have this increase in the proportion of tweet deletions over the years. So starting from 2011 all the way to early 2018, there is an increasing trend. And this isn't raw numbers, like the absolute number of deletions. These are relative to the posts that are created. Okay, so more tweet deletions over time, and maybe some of them are bots. And I try to sort of filter out these bots or non-individual driven deletion events. I'd be happy to talk about those details if people are interested, but suffice to say that deletions are increasing proportion-wise. Sure, yeah.
I was just curious, there was a spike early on. I'm wondering if that was for a specific event.
That was June 2012. And probably there's another spike in around June or 2016. So 2012, 2016 election. Yeah. In fact, I actually looked at the day when Donald Trump descended from that escalator to announce that he's running for presidency. There was a spike in deletions on that day. Yeah. I see. So the question was, is there a uniform pattern in terms of the temporal bursts of tweet deletions? I didn't look at that very closely, but you probably will imagine that it's like a very heavy-tailed sort of. Most of them get deleted within the first minute to first hour. So there is this heavy-tailed distribution. Okay. So going back to that mechanism I was talking about, the idea I had was that people who are in these brokerage positions in the network, those who have a more diverse network, will self-censor more often. And that is actually what we see in the data. So on the y-axis, we have the number of deleted tweets on a log scale, and then the network constraint, which is a network diversity measure, and so it's sort of the inverse of it. So lower values of network constraint means that somebody has a more diverse network. So as the diversity increases, there are more tweet deletions. Controlling for activity level and what else did I control for? Activity level, follower count, and some other variables that I think could be confounding. Okay. Oh, this yellow line, it's the best fit line on the predicted values of this model. So I have a regression model. The log of deleted tweets is the dependent variable. You have the blue dots, which are the observed cases, and the yellow or greenish dots are the predicted values, and this is simply just fitting, the best fit curve on the predicted values. Yeah.
I'd speak points right there.
At 0.4, right? So here, like the vast majority of data points are under 0.5. You can sort of ignore this part. It's like, it's just a result of just fitting this U-shaped curve. But yeah, the vast majority of the data points lie in this region. Okay. And when you categorize the user's polarity or partisanship, control for that, and you still see this increase in tweet deletions with increasing network diversity. Okay. So it doesn't matter whether you're a liberal, conservative, or a moderate, the same pattern sort of holds. I'll skip the one on the right to be mindful of time here. But anyways, so yeah, the network diversity has some correlation with tweet deletions, which we think is kind of capturing this idea of self-censorship. So then the next question is, okay, can these self-censorship patterns produce opinion polarization at the macro level? And there are a couple of questions on this. So first, do brokers or people with diverse networks self-censor more frequently? If you were to kind of play this out in a simulation model, agent-based model. Secondly, do brokers have more moderate opinions? And third, when does self-censorship actually lead to opinion polarization? I won't get into the details of the model, but this is basically using one of those foundational or canonical social influence opinion dynamics models where you have homophily and social influence that are sort of kind of reinforcing certain opinion distributions. The only addition I make to this canonical model is that people can choose whether to share their opinions or not. Right? So they can either post or decide not to post based on the opinion distributions of their neighbors. Right? And when you do that, the main sort of condition that I'm trying to use to sort of gain understanding here is to vary the network types in which these opinions form and people influence one another. Broadly speaking, there are three different network types. There's the clique structure, as you see there. There's a small world network structure, scale-free network structure, as well as some very widely used benchmark networks, like, for example, the Karate Club. And I'd like you to sort of focus on the clique structure because, as you can see, everybody's connected to everybody else. And that is akin to the context collapsed online social environment, right? You post something, yes, not everybody on X will immediately see it, but it is visible. And oftentimes they can propagate, right? The fluid information exchange that these platforms were designed for. Right? So when you have a clique structure, in fact, that is when you actually see a lot of increase in polarization. So now you can think of polarization in terms of what people can observe versus what people actually think, right? The underlying true opinion distribution versus the observed opinion distribution based on what people post, right? And looking at across these different network types, the observed opinion distribution, the polarization increases markedly when you in the completely connected network, which is the context collapse sort of environment. Okay? And the true opinion distribution also tends to polarize more when the users or the agents are communicating in a clique. So yes, the model at least tells us that the context collapse condition, the social media environment, could be responsible for the intense increase in opinion polarization. So what does this all mean for us and for us for society as a whole? Well, I think one implication is that we need to foster closed interactions or such contexts online. When you have these closed contexts, the network brokers may be able to sort of wield their influence and kind of integrate the opinions within their local sort of network without having to worry about how their posts or their expressions would be received in other contexts. And whether companies have incentive to do this or not, whether we need like a more government-driven sort of policy for addressing this issue is some things that I'm thinking about, and I'd be happy to get your opinions on it as well. Okay. Now, granted, this context separation, trying to achieve that with artificially or by creating these online environments can be extremely hard. Like, what do we mean by local context? It's inherently complex, right? And there have been past attempts to address this. For example, Google Plus, right? They had these circles functionality where the users themselves could place different friends or contacts into different circles. In the end, they didn't survive. So I think this is a inherently hard problem to solve. Okay, so the next study is on higher order interactions online. Again, I'd like to focus on how I'm using the data to address a research question using data in unconventional ways. Okay, so what do we mean by higher order interaction? It's basically the interaction like we're having here in a group context, right? So if you think about networks, those are very powerful representations of human interaction, but it's based on edges, right? One-on-one communications or interactions. You kind of group them together and you can get communities, you get all these like really interesting structures that describe a social system. But there may be some fundamental limitations to using a graph or a network representation for studying social systems. Now, there are these affiliation networks, bipartite networks, and other such representations that can somewhat model group interactions, but they are quite limiting, I think. Now, there are these two different ideal types that I think help to make my point here. You have these Cistercian nuns where one-on-one friendships are very explicitly discouraged, right? it can lead to factions, and personal emotions can hinder with their orientation to God. And so one-on-one interactions or friendships are discouraged. On the other extreme, you have these paramedic teams that need to engage not only in like group interactions, but also very efficient one-on-one interactions, right? So let me pose this question. If you were to construct a affiliation network or a bipartite network in these two cases, should this be a null graph or a completely connected clique? Right? So if the one-on-one interactions or friendships are discouraged, shouldn't that be, conceptually speaking, a null graph rather than a clique? And in the opposite case, I think it's pretty clear that it would be a clique. Okay. So there are those sort of limitations. In this work, I'm trying to construct and sort of identify these group interactions, higher order interactions from the tweets that people create. Now, how do you do that? At the very basic level, you want to be able to observe if 3 or more people are sort of orienting their communications to everyone in that group. So how I operationalize that in this study, you take the co-mentioned tweets, right? The tweets where somebody like user A mentions 2 or more people, B and C. User B does the same thing, and user C also co-mentions A and B. So they're sort of explicitly acknowledging, not for the researcher, but just in their behaviors, they're acknowledging that this is a shared, sort of co-present communication. It's a higher order interaction group. And I'll call these filled triangles. Now, and this is a very stringent sort of operationalization. These filled triangles are hard to observe just because there are not many of them. There are enough for analyses, but it is stringent, and there can be these criticisms about, well, that maybe there is a broader audience that should be included in a sort of a co-present context, which you would be losing if you were to impose this really stringent operationalization. But as I show, this actually shows some interesting aspects of group communication that would otherwise be difficult to observe in a graph representation. Okay, so we looked for these filled triangles where A, B, and C all co-mention one another. Here are the number of filled triangles. Closed triangles are filled plus the conventional sort of triadic closure, the closed triangles that we talk about. So filled triangles is a subset of closed triangles. And we look at these numbers across different Anglophone countries. They vary in size and density and all that. Nevertheless, they show pretty similar results in terms of the analyses that we perform. So the first thing we wanted to ask was, okay, how does tie strength differ between any two people who have these shared interaction contexts? So compared to these two nodes or users who are embedded in these third-party communication partners, relative to that, when they have these filled triangles, how do their tie strength increase? And consistently, you see this increase in tie strength as the proportion of these filled triangles increases relative to all the closed triangles. And this happens in all countries, pretty consistent. Now, another thing we looked at was, okay, if this is a group context that is similar to these Cistercian nuns, versus where some other context or teams where there's a lot of one-on-one interactions. You can kind of categorize the filled triangles based on how much one-to-one interactions are occurring in the triad, right? So there can be 0 explicit mentions, right? A mentions B, but only as a co-mention to B and C, right? B is the same, C is the same. On the other hand, when you have, you can have cases where there is co-mentions, but there is also 3-way one-on-one mentions as well, right? And when you compare these different sort of ideal types shown here on the x-axis, and you count the word frequencies of, first-person singular pronouns versus, plural pronouns on the left panel here, and emotional, right? So affect words, how much sort of emotion do you express in the communications? You consistently see that there is a heightened sort of use of pronouns, first-person singular and plural pronouns relative to the average in these relationships. Same thing with the emotions. So people are, they're more sort of conscious of the group, and they use we, us, and our more frequently, and that frequency sort of similar frequencies or patterns are observed with the emotions as well. People are more emotive in their expressions. This I think I'll skip for now. And you can treat these filled triangles as a unit in and of itself, as a node, and construct these higher level induced graphs, right? Where the filled triangle is the node, right? 1, 4, and 5. And they have an edge when there is one of the edges are incident to another filled triangle, right? And so when you construct this sort of induced graph and study its network structure, it gives you ideas about, okay, how integrated or how clustered these group interactions are throughout a given network or in a given country. Right? And this is the New Zealand network. When you construct the induced graph, there are a lot of these clumps that indicate a lot of clustering in these higher order interactions. But there are also these bridging ties that connect different regions or different pockets of focused interactions or clustered interactions. Okay, so that was using Twitter data, plain and simple, but operationalizing, the interactions in a way that kind of makes sense for studying higher order interactions. Okay, the last one I'd like to briefly go over. I have until 1 p.m., right? Okay, I'll make this quick. So this is another study that uses acknowledgments in journal articles to study informal support networks in scientific knowledge production. And it is motivated by the famous study by Lingfei, Dashun, and James Evans, that small teams tend to disrupt, create or generate more disruptive knowledge than larger teams. Now the question is why. This is motivated to try to address that why question. So the explanation that I have in mind is that you have these really large, well-resourced teams that tend to look inward. Because it's a large team, a lot of the needs or ideas can be sourced from within. Whereas in smaller teams, the teammates or the scholars need to look outward, right? They need to gain resources, ideas, and things like that from the outside, right? At tennis courts or mixers, even from old graduate school friends and whatnot. So these are like informal communications and support that you can conceivably obtain through these interactions. And the idea is that small teams will be more disruptive because out of necessity, right? They're seeking intellectual resources from the broader array of ideas. And it is also because of the interpersonal nature, right? The interactions you have with your informal colleagues or old friends or at conferences, these will not necessarily be very much focused or solely focused on one research topic or the project at hand. It will be more sort of diffused sort of topics and free-flowing conversations. Now then the question is, well, what does the structure of these informal conversations and support look like that may be conducive to arriving at interesting, innovative ideas that are more disruptive? So I use acknowledgements in academic journals. Here's an example of Herbert Simon acknowledging these four gentlemen here, and in the acknowledgement section, and it almost reads as if these four gentlemen should also have been co-authors on this paper, right? So you have these acknowledgement, meaningful conversations that are coded in the acknowledgement section. Now, from past research, we already know that smaller teams tend to acknowledge, have more acknowledgements, right? So as the number of authors per publication increases, you have this decrease in the percentage of acknowledgements, right? So there is this sort of inverse correlation, negative correlation between team size and the acknowledgements, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So basically, I wonder, are there assumptions there a small team and big team are reporting those kind of assumptions in a similar way? So assuming that large team, they can also talk to similar amount of people, but there are so many co-authors there, so many people talk to so many people, it's hard to list them on the acknowledgement. But small team, since a small coordination, so they maybe are more likely to list someone outside. So have you considered this assumption in your study?
I haven't actually looked at it in the data, but something like this wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't find some like pattern like this if it's just a matter of, oh, there's just too many people to acknowledge in larger teams. Then to the extent that the page allows you to like include and cram more people to acknowledge, they should look similar, right? Whether you have 10 co-authors or 2 co-authors, if there is limited space for acknowledging 5, then you should see 5 in both cases, right? But that's not what you see. You actually see this decrease. So, yeah. This again comes from old data, 10 sociology journal articles from 2000 to 2009. And I constructed this network of acknowledgements from the authors to other authors who are observed in these 10 sociology journals. I'll skip this part. This is basically, again, showing that there is a negative correlation between the number of scholars who are acknowledged and the number of co-authors on a publication. There's, that negative correlation still holds. Disruptiveness score, I don't think for this crowd I need to elaborate on this. It's basically how much does a publication sort of eclipse its ancestors in terms of citations down the line. So use this disruptiveness index, and when you regress on the disruption index on these covariates, there's an interesting pattern that emerges. So Well, first of all, as the number of co-authors increases at the scholar level, right? The disruptiveness tends to decrease. It's a negative coefficient. And when you look at the acknowledgement patterns in degrees, so this is the number of people who are acknowledging you in their articles. The more I receive acknowledgement, excuse me, the disruption score of my maximum disruption score article, that disruption score tends to increase. But it has a negative correlation with the number of scholars that I acknowledge. Now, structurally speaking, if you sort of zoom out, the network structure of co-authors on the left hand and the network structure of acknowledgement relations on the right hand is a very different structure. You see a much more cohesive, less brittle, and expansive sort of network structure in the acknowledgement network, which also means that there's a better chance that you'll receive and come across really interesting ideas through this informal support network, whereas in the co-authorship network, it is much more sort of concentrated and structurally speaking, it's brittle. This is just kind of quantifying the insights that I was describing. So there are some limitations that Dashun kindly pointed out a couple of months ago, that name disambiguation might be a problem here. Like, how do you know if Xiao Wang is the same Xiao Wang in these different acknowledgements, for example? But since this is a smaller sample of just sociology articles in a 10-year span, when we look at the names and hand check them, there weren't these issues that we could identify. So I'd like to just kind of wrap up with talking about the true value of old data. Roman historians, they have this bookshelf amount of written text, primary sources that were handed down from the Roman Republic, and historians use this much of data and primary sources to gain so much insight about how civilizations come and go, as well as understanding our sort of our history, the Western culture. Now, imagine that historians were handed down 40 million books from the Roman Empire or Roman Republic. And the scholarship that would have been produced if they had so much primary source and data at their disposal. I think a similar lesson could be learned moving forward for us, right? We feel like we have a lot of information and data, but maybe 3,000 years later, this might be an alien, or it might be an evolved form of AI. They're still digging historical records and trying to understand how civilization and society worked 3,000 years before. Maybe we can help with this process by treating old data more seriously and kind of accept that the true value of a data set, we just don't know until the future unfolds. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening. Any questions?
We're almost at time, but we have a couple minutes for questions. Anybody? Brian?
Round, I'm still trying to catch up with it. And obviously the last thing you said is like the thing most easily retrieved in my mind. I'm curious, you brought up this disruption index and you're using it. That disruption index has received a tremendous amount of criticism from like every angle you could imagine. And I'm wondering what you've done in your research, since you're now like on the frontier of using this measure to try to adjust for and account for all of the criticism?
Great question. In fact, the regression results that I showed were a slightly adjusted version of the original disruption score. And I think that the primary issue comes down to the fact that disruption scores are normalized by the total number of citations, whether it's directed to the focal article or to the ancestor articles, the grandparent articles, right? As that n increases, it kind of creates all these weird patterns, and perhaps because of that, the most sort of problematic issue here is the disruption scores that are negative. You can't really interpret the negative scores as you would interpret a positive score. There seems to be this sort of disconnect, right? So let's say it's a negative score, meaning that the number of, let's see, the number of articles that cite my focal article, right? Relative to that, there are more articles that cite both my article as well as the grandparent articles, right? And then it's normalized by the total number of articles that cite these grandparent articles that don't cite my article, right? Now, because of this normalization, you get this weird situation where, okay, the article is not very influential. It has a small sort of following, right? But because of the normalization, right, the denominator is also small. You're going to get these proportions that are not directly kind of aligned with when you have a positive, right? So what I did was I coded all the negative disruption scores to 0, and the results don't change that much. But that was one such adjustment I made. There's also another disruption score version in Russell Funk and the original article. And when I use that score as well, it produces similar results. So it seems to be somewhat robust, but yes, the disruption score I think needs probably a facelift of sorts.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Please.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm curious about in the polarization. So your model showed an increase in the facade of polarization, but also real polarization as a result. Is there empirical work about whether Twitter users are actually more polarized than the rest of the population? Or maybe the whole thing is just a facade of polarization, driven by those online social dynamics?
Yeah, that's hard to answer. I mean, after all, this is like a thought experiment, so to speak, and we don't have data on the sort of selection patterns of Twitter X users relative to the entire population. So I think yes, you have some demographics, and you can use those to kind of gauge the selection patterns. So there's that selection issue at the user level. That's one thing. Whether people are actually really more polarized or not, that's also something that's really hard to measure. But I left that slide out. When you look at this Reddit study that was published a couple of years ago, before versus after the presidential election, yes, there is increased polarization that you observe in the user's behaviors. But when you break this down to the existing users versus the newly joined users, right? Polarization, yes, it does increase among the existing users, but it is not as dramatic as you find when you sort of aggregate all the behaviors, including the new users. I think that's kind of, yeah, that's the best answer I could get.
But like the survey studies that show mixed results of whether there's more polarization, there hasn't been any where they compare people based on online Twitter usage or social media usage.
Question, I haven't looked into that. Yeah, maybe Pew Research has something on that.
All right, thank you, everyone. Let's get a round of applause.